I was struck living here in New York City. The media in the first few weeks of Occupy Wall Street pretended it wasn't happening. Then, when that didn't work, the police began to harass the people. That not only didn't work, it boomeranged. It produced more interest and more sympathy. And the police have ever since been trying to figure out what to do, and they sure haven't figured it out yet. And meanwhile, the media have changed. The media have now become interested. You have, even inside the same newspaper, the New York Times, for example, will have stories that are really quite honest and quite sympathetic, intermixed with stories that are dismissive and denigrating on a scale that would not only offend anybody with an objective notion, but would get you a failing grade in a journalism course for sheer lopsidedness. Yesterday's paper, which had the story about poverty, also carried a story by a columnist named Stewart, in which long quotations about the Occupy Wall Street were taken from a theorist identified as a theorist of the Tea Party movement. And that's a strange place to go for expert opinion on what you're talking about. And the language, the words, the adjectives used in the article were stunning. They go far beyond normal commentary into denunciation. So the New York Times doesn't know which way to go either. But it's already progress that from pretending it wasn't there, they now at least feel the need to have a mixture of stories that are sympathetic as well as hostile. And I think you're going to see more and more signs of this movement changing the consciousness of the country.
In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King was in Memphis, Tennessee, organizing striking sanitation workers. He was planning a Poor People's March in Washington, which was making the Johnson administration very, very nervous. Of course, he never completed those tasks. He was murdered on April 4th. What about mobilizing the poor? Is there scope, is there range for a poor people's movement today?
I think so. I think that the evolving organization and the evolving priorities and debates about what ought to be their priorities is still at an early stage. I mean, I am as impressed as anybody that a movement barely 2 months old as we talk has had the social impact it has. This is a movement that is working far beyond what anyone could have or did imagine. Its social impact, the fact that most national polls indicate a clear majority of Americans are sympathetic with this movement, despite the hostility of the media, despite the hostility of the police and administrations and the violence perpetrated unjustifiably on them. Despite all that, they are growing, and so I'm very hesitant to find fault, and I'm not going to. What I will say is, this early in the movement, they are already reaching out and again showing their unusual success. They have chosen first, for all kinds of reasons, to reach out to the organized labor movement, and they have been stunningly successful. One of the earliest acts of Occupy Wall Street was to march to the headquarters of the Verizon telephone company, a monster company, to show solidarity with a strike of about 45,000 employees, communication workers of America, striking that corporation. They weren't begged to do this. They weren't even asked to do this. They did this as a sign, we care about your struggle. We're going to make your picket lines much larger and much more effective. Shortly thereafter, they discovered a strike at the center of the 1% of America, Sotheby's Auction House, a place where you have to go to bid millions of dollars for rare paintings and jewelry, so you know who goes there. And there was a strike by the skilled workers who assess and manage the art, who happen to be members of the Teamsters Union, and Occupy Wall Street went and supported them, demonstrated out front, sent people in ties and jackets inside to make the point in the middle of the auction, did it very effectively, and the result is powerful. Unions that are traditionally very cautious in the United States about making common cause with upsurging radical social movements broke from that tradition, went down there. When the mayor of New York, Mr. Bloomberg, who used to be called Michael Bloomberg, but his name has now been changed, we now refer to him as Mubarak Bloomberg, when he threatened to close the park 2 or 3 weeks ago, 7 o'clock in the morning, he announced it big mistake the night before. That morning at 6 o'clock, trade unions, thousands of trade unionists from around New York who had been helped by Occupy Wall Street or had already worked with them, came and ringed the park arm in arm and confronted the police, who are also members of a union, by saying, you're going to clean these people out, you'll have to go through your fellow union members, brothers and sisters standing here. 15 minutes before the park was scheduled to be cleared at 7 o'clock, Mubarak Bloomberg canceled the order. So that the next time he came in last week, he had to do it secretly at 1 o'clock in the morning. He had to do a violent dismissal of a peaceful gathering in a private park, not a public park, because he had been outwitted by his earlier failed attempts. So I think you're seeing a movement that understands the need for alliances, made the decision to ally with organized labor, and is now discussing reaching out to other constituencies, one of whom are movements of the poor. And to give you one example, in New York City already, we have movements of the poor that have a special relationship with a theological institute here. It's called the Union Theological Seminary. And they play an important role already in the movement of poor people. And there are lots of close linkages between Occupy Wall Street, Union Theological Seminary, and these movements of the poor. So I think that in the weeks and months to come, you will see public demonstrations of that alliance that is being formed. Yes, I think that we are seeing what a great theorist of society once called uneven development. Nothing in our country organizes development to be even. So, for example, yesterday's headline announced that in a city that has suffered perhaps more than any other American city in the last 25 years, Detroit, Michigan, the mayor of Detroit yesterday announced he's laying off 10% of the public employees in order to deal with a budget gap to save $10 million. $10 million. That's about 10 minutes of expenditure in Afghanistan. That's a trivial amount of money for a Wall Street executive to take out of his bonus. We're allowing things to be done with $10 million that are not being used to allow the people of Detroit a decent public employee service, which has already been cut back. It's unconscionable what we're doing. And the same thing with Chrysler and Ford. To destroy a union and to destroy a working class by getting the people in the plant to vote for a program that applies to people not yet hired, who are now going to have to suffer a cut of 50%, that's austerity. That's nothing other than austerity. It's a way to make money for these companies. It divides the working class. It's an assault on all of us. Because remember, the worker who is paid $14 an hour instead of 28 will not have a lot of money to spend going to a bowling alley or stopping by a restaurant or getting his kids some toys at Christmas time. And that's bad for everybody else in the country, except for those corporations who get away with it. And that's the way this country has been working. And Occupy Wall Street is challenging that. But we're going to have to get much stronger before we're in a position to rule that out of order as it should have been. Well, the people's fears are real. In terms of the economics of whether these fears are justified, the answer is a clear no. And let me explain. The way our Social Security system works, it's called a pay-as-you-go system. Basically, Social Security, from its inception, in the depths of the Depression, when all the rich people in America said there's no money for anything, and all the rich people said that there's no way to raise any money for people, there was a people's movement from below, the CIO, the Socialist and Communist parties, and guess what? They didn't buy it. They said there's plenty of money, the government just has to go get it. And they forced Roosevelt to change his politics to do exactly that. So Roosevelt, in the middle of the Depression when there was supposedly no money, created Social Security. Said, the government has all the money it needs to give everybody who's over 65 a decent way to live out the rest of their life, having given a lifetime of work. Not only that, there's an unemployment insurance program I'm going to start to give everybody who's laid off money, which we had never done before. And better than that, I'm going to create and fill 11 million jobs between 1934 and 41. The money for that, which all the rich and the corporations said wasn't around, turned out to be around. And let's make no mistake, Roosevelt raised a good bit of the money to pay for all that by taxing corporations and taxing the rich. The top income tax bracket, the richest Americans, had to pay 94% of the money they got. Every dollar over 100,000, they had to give Washington 94 cents. They got to keep 6. The number today is you give Washington 35 cents, you keep the other 65 cents. In other words, Roosevelt taxed the rich, and he did it this way. He went to them and he said, you better give me the money I want in taxes so I can take care of the people, because if you don't, the people are going to take care of you. And he split the business community by saying that, because half of them thought he was right, and that it would be much smarter to pay taxes than to take the risk of what the CIO and the socialists and the communists would have done otherwise if they'd had their chance. It was a people's movement below that gave Roosevelt the way to save capitalism, even from itself. And I think today the money is there. If we just, for example, went back to the level of taxes we had, say, in the 1950s and 60s in this country, tax levels endorsed by Republicans and Democrats alike, then we would raise the money, so all this discussion of cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security would be completely out the window, no problem at all. So yeah, if you leave everything as it is, Social Security is in trouble. But if you stop accepting everything as it is, which is what Occupy Wall Street's about, then there's no economic problem whatsoever in taking care of the older Americans, which a decent society wouldn't even be questioning the importance of doing. You only get taxed for Social Security on your wage and salary income. You don't get it applied to your interest income, to your dividend income. That's one of the ways people who are rich avoid having to pay their fair share, because they're exempted. So we exempt every dollar of salary you get over 107,000. So the millionaires pay the same as people who are barely getting 107. And you don't tax, in any case, non-wage and salary incomes, incomes from property, incomes from wealth, incomes from money. So sure, if you wanted to increase the flow of Social Security, go to where you haven't taxed. And that's, of course, not to put so fine a point on it, the rich, those who earn over 107,000 a year, and or those who get huge portions of their income from the Social Security tax exempt interest, dividends, and so forth. And those are the sources of income that are significant for the rich in this country. You know, it's no accident. The rich people and the corporations have been smart. They've used their wealth to do something. They know better than the rest of us that if you have a country with a small number of people that are super rich and a mass of people that aren't, there's a risk when you have votes and democracy, at least politically, that the mass of people who are disadvantaged will use the political system to correct what the economic system is producing in the way of inequality. So the rich people figured out, we better make sure we control the political system so it can't be used to undo the wealth we've cornered into our hands. That's why our congressmen and women and our senators are dependent on money, because it makes sure they do the bidding of the 1% and not the bidding of the 99%. And that's what Occupy Wall Street is creating as its enemy, as the thing to be changed. It's saying we have to bring real democracy instead of these voting rituals back into our system, and there's no way to do that other than separating politics from an unfair and unjust distribution of wealth and income.